Hey guys. Well, I've been going through and the next lecture is going to be on balance. Now, I wrote up here balance with a little proportion. I was originally, and I still may do it, I just want to prepare you that this may be just balance and not proportion. Proportion, in my mind, I was going to get into the golden mean and how to, not necessarily how to, but what it is to use proportion in a certain way. The golden mean kind of is a mathematical equation, and as I was working up the lecture, I was thinking that this might be a little too intense to add to the balance lecture. Now, having said that, I think that I will want to do a proportion lecture if there is time. What I mean by that is, in my opinion, after about 30 minutes, I start to fade when I'm watching any video. Unless it's a movie that has action and things going on, I don't really want to go to YouTube and watch a video for more than 30 minutes. In fact, 20 minutes is kind of my limit when it comes to instructional things, unless it's really interesting and not a typical lecture. Having said that, we do need to touch on proportion. I don't know if I'll do it today or I'll just do a separate video and we'll get into it at a later date. All right, so the basics of balance. Now, balance is difficult to talk about in artistic terms. Well, it's not difficult, but we have to get past what balance is. Balance is a very generic word, and it's something that is used in everyday life. It's different the way we talk about it when it comes to art. For example, if, say you're working too much and you're not playing very much, your life is out of balance, right? So, you know, you can feel uncomfortable if you don't have a center, the correct ratio between work and play. In art, balance refers to the distribution of weight or the actual apparent weight of elements of a composition. See, now this is where it's different. When we talk about, and I get into slides a little bit later individually about these things, but when we talk about weight in the real world, we talk about our mind, what we kind of think something weighs. For example, a bowling ball. We pretty much expect it to weigh roughly about 10 pounds. It could be 16, it could be 8, right? Our mind knows what that is, and so we assign a weight to it. And if we put a feather on the other side of this fulcrum, like on a scale, we know that in our mind the feather doesn't weigh very much, so the bowling ball is going to weigh more, right? Well, in art, there are certain ways that we can kind of address this issue, and you need to think about balance, not in the real world. I mean, we do use parts of our interpretation of the real world in determining balance when it comes to art, but the reality is that there's a lot more that goes into it when we're talking about 2D. Now, there are some references in this lecture about 3D, and I'll try to make note that that's 3D and not 2D. Now, when we talk about 2D in art, we're talking about pictorial balance. Pictorial balance refers to the distribution or the apparent or visual weight of the elements in works that are basically two-dimensional, and there are many ways to achieve it. That's kind of what I was just talking about. We can break down balance 3 basic ways: horizontal balance, vertical balance, and radial balance. Now, these 3 ways of breaking balance down are not types of balance. What they are is descriptors to balance, if that makes sense. We have radial, which just describes that something's going around. Vertical, meaning it's up and down, and horizontal, left and right. Now, on this graphic over here, this is where when I was first taught balance, this is kind of what messed me up. And I wasn't really sure if I should give this image because a lot of people are going to focus on this, and I don't want you to. I don't want you to think of balance as a scale in the real world sense. See, if we look at this right here, it's a scale, and they're showing 1 to 1, and it's balanced, right? It's basically you have one item here, one item here. Now our mind tells us that's balanced because each one of these objects are the same size and they're the same distance from the outsides of this center point. And here we have another example where these are further away, but this is larger, and in the end it balances out. Here we have one object and multiple objects, and that balances out. The problem with using this model is that a lot of students are going to visualize this and use that as a way to write what is balance. And that's not the way I want you to think of it. This is only what our mind does. Our mind weighs the different sides and tries to understand the weight of one object and compare it to the weight of another. When we talk about art, it's what our mind does to determine the balance, okay? I know that sounds kind of strange, but when I was in undergrad and I was told to demonstrate that I understood balance, I did this right here. I put a fulcrum right in the center and I put two objects on either side. For some reason, it just made it easier. But that wasn't what I was supposed to do. What I was supposed to do is to use this as a reference of how to determine if something is in balance or not. And here are the other two descriptors. We have vertical balance, top to bottom, and radial balance. We have a center point that everything radiates out of. Okay, when we talk about these, horizontal, vertical, and radial balance, in the works of art that with horizontal balance, the elements at the left and right sides of the composition seem to be about equal in number or visual emphasis, and that's the key, visual emphasis. In vertical balance, the elements at the top and the bottom of the composition are in balance, and radial balance, the design elements radiate from a center point. All right, just kind of talked about that on that last slide. Okay, now those were descriptors. Now we're going to talk about different types of balance. First we have symmetrical balance, and then we have approximate symmetrical balance, and then we have asymmetrical balance. Now through the lecture I've got some examples, and I kind of talk about them a little bit, but the repetitious nature of this symmetrical work, it is symmetrical because it looks like almost like a mirror is right down the center, is counterbalanced and relieved by the active interlacing of the linear pattern. This composition is divided equally on either side of the subtle vertical axis. Again, if we were to draw a line straight down the center, they would match up on either side. So that is symmetrical. So, working with symmetrical balance is the near or exact matching of left and right sides of a three-dimensional form or a two-dimensional composition. Again, I want you to forget about the three-dimensional form, and we're just concerned about the two-dimensional composition. A lot of what we're talking about refers to the 3D, but if you start getting the 3D in, then we start talking about actual weight. And that can kind of confuse the whole subject. So if we're working with just 2D, it's implied or pictorial balance and weight. You can divide the human body in half vertically, and in the ideal, as it is in Da Vinci's drawing here, will be an exact correspondence between the left and right sides. Now this isn't completely exact. The legs down here are a little bit different, but as we move up further up the body, for the most part, it is symmetrical. Now, The caveat to some symmetry is approximate symmetry. It's not exact. It can be created by a work having a symmetrical feeling. Now, we're talking about symmetrical balance, but I would suggest that this is approximate symmetry. It's not exact, but it is under symmetrical, if that makes sense. As we move forward, in this painting, the portrait of Hung Chi, the ruler sits stiffly facing us. His hands are concealed by his garments. Now, I'm hoping that you can see this clearly. The lights are on, so I'm not sure. But I've drawn a dashed line up the center. And again, one of the things that I use to kind of imagine if something is symmetrical, now, not approximate symmetrical, but symmetrical, is if I were to put a mirror on one side, would it be exactly what is on the other side? In this situation, it looks like it, but it isn't. It's approximate symmetry. Only a few asymmetrical dragons on the screen behind him and some items on his cloak reveal overall rigidity of the composition. Color is symmetrically placed, yet its richness also serves to lighten the air of formality. If we look, the colors are pretty much the same. Now, there are differences. It's not exact, like the dragons on these medallions aren't exact, so it's approximate symmetry, but it's so close to being symmetrical that if you weren't looking for it, your eyes would say it was symmetrical. The emperor wanted to convey dignity, permanence, and majesty, and this artist's use of symmetry helps to create those impressions. All right, now we move over to approximate symmetry. As I mentioned, it's rare, well, I think I mentioned it, it's rare to have something that's actually symmetrical. There's implied or almost suggested symmetry, but even in the painting of the emperor, we didn't have exact symmetry. It was close, but not exact. Approximate symmetry requires more sensitivity from the artist regarding the various weights of the components. And this is where, if you understand this is where we kind of start to get into how to determine what if something is in balance. The apparent weights of the components must still be equal or balance out. That's important. The apparent weights of the components must still be equal or balance out. It's not the actual weights. It's visually what we look at when we see a round circle and a small square. We need to visually understand what it is we're looking at and to determine the mass or the weight of those shapes and figure out if they are in balance or they are out of balance. The differences add variety, thereby producing more interest, but at the loss of some harmony. So basically, you don't want, if you want something to be interesting, you pretty much don't want symmetrical balance. You pretty much want asymmetrical. You want there to be balance, but don't repeat, don't have that mirror image. The mirror image is lack of another word. It's not interesting. It can be, but it's not. If we were to look at this image right here, this painting, while the format of this image is symmetrical, the central image is rendered asymmetrically by modifying the positions of the trees, figures, and elephant. The vertical axis is still retained. So if we were to critique this, I would draw, when I put this dashed line in there, I put it as close as I could to the center. If we were to look at that, there's different elements that have different weight. We have a larger woman, larger than these two, and we have a tree. Now this larger woman is off to the left. These two are closer to the center. Now, if we were just to visually identify these, we would probably say that these two are heavier because the tree doesn't have a lot of mass to it. But because the woman is off to the left and these are closer up, just like if we were to have two objects on a fulcrum, if we were to put this right close to the center and this off to the edge, even though this is smaller, it doesn't have as much weight, it's going to be heavier because it's further away. And that's kind of what's going on with this image here. These are further away than these. Now we get into this a little bit more in detail in a couple slides. But here we have something that's symmetrical, but it's approximate symmetrical. Our eyes, our mind usually will say, no, it's symmetrical. But once we look at it a little bit longer, we start to see it as being approximate, symmetrically balanced. And here's another example. Now we've got, this image is called handball, and we've got, it looks like 6 young men, don't know their ages, but they are either watching or playing handball. Now if we look at this, there are a couple things that should draw us in. The first is the foreground. These two young men are standing there watching, both with their backs to us. And when we have basically 3 figures that are closer, further away, smaller than these two. Now if we were to draw a line right down the center, there's a couple things that would happen. Number one is we have the number 1 right here. If I were to kind of draw a triangle from here, here to here, it would pretty much be a perfect triangle. There wouldn't be any problems with it. If we were to counterbalance the distance that this guy is out, remember he's right on that edge, and that means that visually he weighs more than this person, but when we add this extra area, this darkness kind of adds an extra amount of weight. It's not heavy enough to tip the balance over, but it's enough to hold it together. So basically we have the one, these two, and this one. And these don't really matter because they're balanced out with each other. But our eyes will say that this is in balance, even though it's approximate symmetry. Now the other one is asymmetrical. It's the opposite of symmetrical. In asymmetrical balance, the left and right sides are not the same. Various elements are balanced according to their size and meaning around a felt or implied center of gravity. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can get balance with asymmetrical design. A large form, and these are some of them, I think there's 6 of them total, visual weights of color and forms. A large form is heavier, more attractive, or more attention-getting than a small form. Because of this, 2 or more small forms can balance one large form. Again, if we were to put a bowling ball here and say an apple over here, visually the bowling ball is going to seem heavier. It's bigger, it's dark, the apple's kind of here, it's red. It's just going to imply that it's heavier. Now if I was to put 2 or 3 apples on this side, now we're starting to kind of get it to be equal. We have more objects on one side, and if the objects are picked in such a certain way or placed in a certain area of the composition, we can get balance, even though this bowling ball suggests that it weighs quite a bit. A form gathers visual weight as it nears the edge of a picture. In this way, a small form near and edge can balance a larger from near the center. And that's kind of what I was talking about. Again, I'll use this as an example. If I put this here and this out to the edge of the composition, and this is our center point, this is actually going to possibly be heavier than a larger object. So the closer it gets, once it gets to, say, this point, the composition starts to look out of balance, asymmetrically out of balance. Because this is closer, it's going to suggest that it weighs less, and it's smaller. A complex form is heavier than a small form. Because of this, a small complex form can balance a large simple form. For example, if we were to get something that had a lot of moving parts to it, say an engine or something like that, and then we had something that had very little to look at, it was very simple, and something with a lot of parts, it would suggest that it was equal. Even that it would be balanced if they were the equal distance from the fulcrum point, even though that this could weigh more, if that makes sense. More objects, more complex objects, appear heavier to most people. Okay, now the extra point, and this isn't really that complicated. I think we do this normally, but as artists we need to be aware of it. Warm colors are heavier than cool colors. A single yellow form can balance a large dark blue form. So you remember what warm colors are. Warm colors are ones that have red in them. Cool colors are colors that have blue. Intense colors are heavier than weak or pale colors, tints and shades. Hence, a single small bright blue form near the center can balance out a large pale blue form near an edge. The intensity and the weight of any color increases as the background color approaches its complementary hue. On a green background, a small, simple red form can balance a large, complex form. So basically, if a color is brighter, it gets our attention. And if something gets our attention, we tend to give it a little bit more weight. Colors that are more intense versus the same hue, a hue that is intense versus the same hue that maybe is 50%, is the intense hue is going to appear to be heavier. All things being equal, it will appear to be heavier. Now here's working with some images. If I were to look at this is called the Evening Glow of the Ando. It's Japanese art and it's old. This composition seems balanced. If I were to look at this, and I'm hoping that you get the same feel from it, is that it appears to be balanced. It just feels comfortable. There's nothing that feels out of the ordinary. The composition seems balanced. The strong diagonal of the wall and the floor is accented by the heads of the two subjects. If we look at this right here, and this right here, and then we follow through, the heads follow this line. The diagonal provides the principal focus of the composition. When you look at this is what you see. The curves of the water in the upper left have no counterpart except for the curves of the figures at the center. These curves right here. The lightness of the water in the tree branches is balanced by the solidly anchored candlelight that the other fire is adjusting. So this right here looks like a typo. The horizontal lines of the alcove and the floor mats give a rhythm to the composition, which the principal diagonal often interrupts. So we have the horizontal, but the diagonals are taking precedence. They are the most important elements when we look at this. The result is that we have something that appears to be balanced. It's because of the different elements and how they're interacting with each other. There's not a lot of weight up here. The stream is basically hollow. There's not a lot of color. There's not a lot going on with it. If we look down here, there's a lot more. This has more weight than this, or similar weight. The darker character right here seems to balance out this area. If we were to break this up into quarters, we have upper left, upper right, lower left. And we can kind of break it down. This section to this section kind of feels balanced, even though that she's higher and a larger. If we look at this shape, it's larger than this one. But the use of the colors are kind of playing with our eyes. These two elements come together to counteract the darker value of this subject. Then we have something here that isn't very heavy. So that further diminishes the weight of this side. And over here we have actually part of the image that we have something that we can kind of look at, and that strengthens or weights this side of it. Now I'm hoping that makes sense. If I were to look at this, I see that it's balanced. It's asymmetrically balanced. There's nothing, if I were to draw a line right down the center, there's nothing that mirrors over. But when we look at the different elements and how they relate to each other on a whole, we start to see that it is balanced. It's just not asymmetrically balanced. Now this is a Degas. It's called Jockeys Before the Race. Now I did this was I kind of recreated something I saw in a textbook. But when we look at this, most people would say, no, that's not balanced. There's no balance to that at all. For the average person, it's going to say all the weight is over here. And if we were to put, say, a scale right in the center, that fulcrum point, the image would kind of like fall to the right. Until you start to look at it, and you get a little sophisticated with looking at balance, you start to see how Degas kind of addressed this issue. He made something very interesting, in my opinion, and he did it by using balance in a certain way. Now see, what Degas did is he uses visual cues to move our attention from right to left. If you look at this right here, the jockey is looking this direction. The horse is looking at this direction. Now when we see this jockey here, we don't see very much of this jockey, but we're not getting any indication. Nothing is telling us to look. Here, we kind of want to follow the attention of what's going on. Now, if you look over here, we would follow this over. And once we follow, our eyes follow over to here, kind of where that line of sight is, we have the sun up at the upper left. If we are sensitive to the different elements, we will perform the act of balancing the painting. This is kind of what I'm saying, that the average person is going to say, no, that there's no balance here. It's not balanced. If we aren't sensitive, the painting will seem unbalanced. The large horse in the lower right is the center of attention. It's counterbalanced by the sun in the upper left. Diagonal opposition is common in asymmetrical compositions. So we have a diagonal that's coming across. And this sun, now you may not see it. I mean, I could argue that it's not strong enough to make this a balanced piece. But that sun should balance the horse over here. Typically, and this kind of gives you an example of what we would normally look. This would be our focal point. This would be the center, kind of what our eyes would look for, this vertical line right here. And we have all this space over here and this space over here. And it gives us this interpretation that it's all weighted to one side. But until we actually look at the sun and we realize that the sun does give it some weight, that it starts to balance out a little bit. Now, radial balance. Radial balance is pretty simple. It really is. Radial balance can create true or approximate symmetry. Here, I think these are pencils or brushes or something. And in radial balance, forces are distributed around a central point. Here we have this point right here in the center, and it starts here and then goes out from there. The result in visual circulation adds a new dimension to what may otherwise be a static, symmetrical balance. Common in the applied arts of jewelers and potters. We can use it. Sometimes you get unique effects working with photography if you use like a radial balance. There are other ways to use it as well.